afternoon, everyone. Many of you know who I am. I'm John Devenel, one of the volunteers here at the Homestead. And before we get to our program for today, I would just like to let all of you know, and probably this is the first time that you'll hear about it, is that we are going to have a fundraiser on March 24th, which is the last Saturday of the month. And the program is called Stories from Behind the Barn. And the person who will be here is Bill Torrey, who happens to be sitting in our audience today, and he's going to say a few words in just a minute. I'm going to read you one quote about what Bill does. He's a Vermont storyteller. The quote goes like this. It says, Bill Torrey is a storyteller, too pure to be real and too funny to be believed. Spend a little time with him, though, and you will realize that 1 in a million person who has lived his life fully, felt it, loved it, and knows how to talk about it. Great storytellers and great stories don't always find each other. With Bill Torrey, it's a head-on collision. And that's a quote from Tom Bodette. Some of you may remember Tom from the Motel 6 ads, we'll leave the lights on for you. So another great storyteller. So I'm going to introduce Bill for just a minute to give you an idea as to what he'll be doing here with us on March 24th.
Hello, thank you all for coming. Hope to show up on the 24th. I'm a sixth generation Vermonter. My family moved here in 1767, and I've spent my life working in the woods of Vermont. And now I'm doing storytelling about my life. And I don't know if you are familiar, if you're an NPR listener, with the Moth storytelling. I'm a Moth main stage performer. I've won 4 Moth Story Slams. I performed at Middlebury College, the State House, and just a lot of places around. Probably haven't heard of me. I'm kind of a cross between Rusty DeWeese and Mac Parker without the jail time. So I'll be entertaining you with a series of short stories, Moth-style stories that are true first-person stories most about my life when I was a kid growing up in the 60s, and the stupid stuff that we did and the lessons that we learned doing them. So if you want to come out and have a good time, and get some laughs in, I'd be happy to woodchuck in soft dirt if you'd come. Thank you.
And just let you know, tickets are going to be $15, and Bill is donating all the proceeds to the Homestead. He's doing this totally on his own, so we hope you can join us. You know, we have limited seating because of the space we have here, and we will be selling tickets after if you would like to get some today. And with this, I will turn it over to our director, Dan O'Neill.
Hi, everyone. You should notice the only reason they keep me around is because I know how to work the electronics in this place. You know, it's my secret plan so that they can't ever fire me. But I want to thank you all for being here, for attending our third Sunday lecture. It's always a pleasure to see this many people here. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Susan Ouellette is a professor of history and American studies at St. Michael's College. She is the author of U.S. Textile Production in Historical Perspective, a case study from Massachusetts, and she's had a long interest in the history of the Champlain Valley. She's also on our board of directors and helps us quite a bit with our historical interpretation. Her talk today is going to be on the journal of Phoebe Orvis from 1820 to 1830. In 1820, Phoebe Orvis began a journal that she faithfully kept for a decade, richly detailed. Her diary captures not only the everyday life of an ordinary woman in early 19th century Vermont and New York, but also the unusual happenings of her family, neighborhood, and beyond. So please welcome Professor Oulette.
Thank you. Whenever I follow someone of Dan's stature, it always means that the microphone's not going to work. I am not an expert at the electronics, so he's definitely got that all by himself. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming today.
An Extraordinary Ordinary Woman was a real labor of love for me. I really believe, someone asked me, actually just last night, how it was that I came to do this and why I chose to write about Phoebe. And what I said to this person was, I didn't choose her, she chose me. And I really believe that because first of all, I had no idea who Phoebe was and didn't really know a lot about the period that she lived, other than just the broad strokes of Vermont history. And I accidentally came into possession of a typescript copy of the diary that was made in 1960 by a wonderful woman, Mary Smallman, who had rescued the diary literally from the dustbin. A person who dealt in old books had bought a box of books at a yard sale in Plattsburgh, New York, and in the bottom of the box of books was this little, and it's very small. The actual diary is probably only about, it's sort of like a regular sheet of paper folded in half. It's like about that size. And in fact, it's handmade. The sheets of paper were folded and stitched. And then every possible square centimeter is covered with her writing. And it's really amazing. It's just one small book, but it spans 10 years, and she wrote in it almost every single day. Now, she doesn't write long soliloquies each day. Often the day is a very short little synopsis. The weather, always the weather, and then some observation of the day itself. So when Mary was offered the diary because the bookseller said, well, this really doesn't have any value, she took it, and this is what she told me many years later, is she took it and kind of put it away. And then at a moment in her life when she needed something to concentrate on, she pulled it out and started reading it and realized, oh, this is really a prize. And so she started to handwrite the diary, and eventually she took her handwritten notes and typed them on a manual typewriter. And so what I have, what she gave me, is the original typescript, and there's actually 2 copies because she typed the 2 pages together with the carbon paper in between. When I explain that to my students, they have absolutely no clue what I'm talking about. So I'm always really, I have to have a little bit of a chuckle about the technology has really changed life for us. Well, so when I met Mary, again, a very sort of accidental meeting, and we talked about our interests, she decided to give me everything that she had collected. And so she handed me, she was in her late 80s at the time, and she gave me this file box full of stuff, including the diary, and she said, I know that you'll do something with it. And I said, well, thank you very much, and I brought it home. And at that point, I read the diary, and when I read it, I was just blown away because, first of all, the writing of women, especially ordinary women, and especially ordinary women in this time, not much has survived. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, and most of the reasons are that, most of the fact is that women's writings were not considered important. And even though women often were the glue that kept families together, in other words, they wrote the letters to relatives far away, often then shared the letters that they got back in return, and chronicled the family life, whether through a diary or a journal, or even just keeping track of the family books. And yet, we don't really take that writing until recently, we don't take it very seriously. In fact, when I first put the manuscript together and started shopping it around, I sent a copy, or rather I sent a proposal, not the manuscript itself. I sent a proposal to a press in Western New York thinking that they would be really interested in it because they were publishing a lot of diary materials, and it seemed to be right in their bailiwick. And the editor wrote me a really short email back saying, well, we're really not interested in the words of an ordinary woman. And the title of the book was born. So he's at the end of his little 3-sentence email, he said, well, if you want to talk about it, you can call me at blah, blah, blah. I don't think he expected me to call. And I did. And I spent the next 10 minutes telling him why, first of all, Phoebe wasn't an ordinary woman, or at least her words weren't ordinary. And second of all, that this would be published, and but it wouldn't be published by his press because they clearly did not understand the importance of this, and I wasn't going to take a lot of time to explain it to him. And his parting words were, well, if you change your mind, you've now made me interested. That didn't happen. So let me tell you a bit about Phoebe. I picked up the manuscript and started reading the typescript diary, and I got about halfway through, and I came to a fascinating entry, and it blew me away because all through the first part of the manuscript, she never hinted once that she was going to get married. And so I get to the entry on Wednesday, the 5th of February, 1823, and she writes, pleasant, that's the weather. Every first word is the weather. What a dreadful day is this. Miss Sally Prime waited upon me today and this eve, and Mr. Henry Byington, Mr. Eastman's waiter, to the marriage ceremony performed by Esquire Peer. And then she wrote in parentheses, he presented me with the $1. It must have been a custom of the time. Farewell to a sweet single life. I can no more enjoy you. Packed my goods, ready to depart. What a change to relinquish parents and friends, all for one of the other sex. Surprising and unpleasant. And it was, pomp to the fore. I'm looking at it thinking, wait a minute, she didn't say anything about him having proposed, except, well, she did mention the first time she met him, he proposed to her, and she said, oh, are you crazy? I don't even know you, right? And then that's it. I mean, she mentions him occasionally coming along, but there's this whole other love story that I'd been following through, and suddenly she's married to this guy, and it's surprising and unpleasant. So I knew right away that there were stories buried in the diary that are not easily understood by just surface reading. And so I began to look really closely at the diary and began to research some of the people, when I could identify people, with some of the people that she mentioned. One of the first projects that I did with the diary before I even conceived of creating a book manuscript was looking at her education. Now, her handwriting was really very good, but not perfect. Her spelling wasn't perfect either, but she had an eloquence about her writing that was attractive, and it made me wonder, okay, so how much education did she really have? And so I started to comb the diary looking for evidence of this. One of the pieces of evidence that kind of floated to the surface was that first of all, she was a great reader. She recorded almost all of the books that she read, or at least as far as I can tell. She loved travel narratives, and especially, but she also read treatises and sermons and adventures, and so she read Zadok Steele's memoir of being a captive. So she had a very broad variety of things that she read. Now one might think that, okay, so maybe she just had very eclectic tastes. But I actually think that she was limited to the library that she had access to, which was the Sunday school library that she was borrowing the books from. But it seems clear like her favorite choices were the travel narratives that she tended to read. And then I realized, I didn't know a lot about this until I started reading about it in her diary, but I realized that she not only had completed sort of the average schooling expectation of young people, especially girls in this period, which is learning how to read and write and basic arithmetic, the dame school kind of education, but she then began to pursue what really turns out to be some of the first higher education of the day. She went to Emma Willard's school in Middlebury. And I was completely blown away when I figured that out. It took me a little bit, but once I figured it out, it was like, oh my gosh. And then the entry of her going to school really summed it up for me, because having taught at college for the last 25 years, 20 at St. Michael's, I'm very familiar with the kinds of things that especially young women, young freshman women will say. So here's her entry on the first day of her attending Emma Willard's school. Attended the Ladies' Quarterly School by Miss Lucy Burnap. Now Lucy Burnap is actually the teacher that worked for Emma Willard and then took over the school after Emma Willard moved it to New York State. Enjoyed very disagreeable feelings from various courses. First, on account of my being an entire stranger to most of the ladies, and they to me. Second, being entirely unacquainted with the manner and customs of the school. Third, have not attended any kind of school for some years, which of course rendered me more ignorant than others of the school. Then she wrote in parentheses, these reflections, I conclude, effects of injured pride. However, I am extremely pleased with Mrs. Burnap. Her dress is plain, her manner easy and agreeable, and excels on piety, which renders her exemplary and amiable. The school commences by reading two verses apiece of scripture. Miss B makes an introductory prayer next, attend to writing. In geography, a lesson in Cummings' geography is next. Parsing English grammar in the afternoon. Rhetoric, logic, philosophy, and other studies. Have singing instead of reading before prayer in the evening. So, first of all, she was a really busy student. They were doing really the kind of education that a young man would expect at Middlebury College. And in fact, I learned later that Emma Willard planned her school and developed her curriculum based on Middlebury College. So her education that she got at the school was one that was pretty sophisticated. But what really struck me about that entry are the things that I hear from young women all the time. Am I smart enough? Am I dressing the right way? Can I make friends? Those are universal questions that young women, young men too, but young women especially have been asking themselves. Every freshman who goes off to college each year probably has either verbalized those ideas and those concerns, or at least thought about them deeply in their mind. Now, unfortunately for Phoebe, she doesn't stay at school for that long. She stays for one term. And the reason that she has to leave is because she's become close with a certain gentleman that her family doesn't really approve of. Now, on the surface, in the 20th century, or even in the 21st century, the idea that a young man who's been educated at Middlebury College and intends to be a teacher would be a fairly respectable kind of profession. But in 1823, the idea that in this case, their granddaughter, because Phoebe Phoebe was raised by her grandparents, that she would go off with someone who was facing itinerant work and not very good wages and who knew what kind of lifestyle was wrong. And in fact, she needed to marry somebody who had land and was a farmer, because that's where real security was, in the land. And so they really didn't approve. Now, I think they went about this very craftily, because they don't really say direct things to her that she ever records. So I think there was a lot of backdoor discussions about Mr. Adolphus Taylor that she never heard. But the results of those backdoor discussions are evident in the diary when you begin to peel away the sort of onion skin variety of the little stories involved. And so what happens is, at the end of her term, as she's finishing up, her Uncle John comes to Middlebury and says to her, okay, you need to pack up. You're coming home with me now, and your Aunt Durfee is coming from Hopkinton, New York, and you're going to go home with her because she needs you. Now, she didn't want to go because, first of all, Adolphus was in Middlebury, and second of all, she was not excited about going out to Hopkinton. Now, you have to imagine, this is 1823. In 1823, the New York frontier was a wilderness, a complete wilderness. The War of 1812 had really only ended about 6 years before. So you have this area that had been the scene of a good deal of military activity, and you have the beginning remnants of settlers either coming back in or probably more likely coming there for the first time. And her aunt and uncle, the Durfees, her maternal aunt and uncle, are now established in a tavern on the road between Hopkinton and Potsdam. In fact, the building's still there. It's really one of the things that kept happening over and over again was, long ago, I taught for a very short time as a replacement faculty member at SUNY Potsdam. I drove past this building every single day, and I noticed it because it was a fascinating building built in the federal style, and, or at least, you know, mostly a federal style of Potsdam sandstone. So it's really interesting building. So I knew the building, and when I read the description in the diary, I knew exactly where her aunt and uncle lived. I knew exactly where she went when she went out to live with them in Hopkinton. Well, when she arrived in Hopkinton, well, first of all, I'll read you an entry. This is how much she didn't want to go. Took leave of my home that has sheltered me 19 years to see a new country. Left them in tears as we rode slowly in a wagon in the winter season, everyone at their window of my acquaintance, it appears. And it's as if I were following some friend to the tomb. Uncle John went with us as far as the creek at Virgins. Mr. Watkins started with them, left his pork bag, had to go back for it, and then we proceeded alone. He overtook us at Essex. The village is situated very pleasant on the lake shore. We crossed the cracks, the last cracks the horses broke through. Put up at Drew's Inn the first night, and this is the first night I ever stayed at a public house. Rode 15 miles on the ice and stayed with different strangers. So she's clearly not happy about this, even though this interest in travel diaries or travel writings, for instance, should have made her really excited about it. But it's clear that's not what was going on for her, and it's pretty clear to me in reading more closely that in fact she's incredibly sad about leaving her amour behind. And before she left, they exchanged love gifts. So he gave her his pocket watch, which is a very valuable and somewhat rare item in the period, and she gave him a ring that had a piece of her hair in it. Very typical sort of antebellum kind of thing. This is tantamount to an engagement. Now, it wasn't an official engagement because parents weren't, or grandparents weren't approving of it. But from her point of view, she and Adolphus were engaged. And now she was being forced to move 100 miles away, and she didn't know if she was going to be able to see him and how her life was going to proceed. Well, about 3 months after she was out there at her aunt and uncle's, a whole bunch of stuff happens in between. She's there for the 4th of July celebration. Her aunt and uncle spend a lot of time pitching farm boys through the window at her, trying to get her interested in some of the locals. The people that they were really interested in having her form an attachment to were the Eastman family. Now, interestingly enough, the Eastman family were also Bristol people who'd gone out much earlier. And so the father, Samuel Sr., had purchased a fairly large piece of land from the Macomb patent, and then he'd subdivided it among his sons. And 3 of his sons weren't married. And so it appears to me, as you read the diary, that they didn't really care which one of the sons she married. They just wanted her to marry one of them because they all had 100 acres. They were all engaged in farming. And so they were the upstanding kind of young men that they wanted her to marry. She had different ideas. She thought that they had poor manners. She couldn't stand Lee at all. She often used euphemisms for him, but essentially she thought he was a real jerk. She wasn't as negative towards Samuel, who she eventually married, but she didn't really care for him either. And the 3rd brother she rarely mentions, but it seems clear that he also was not much of a favorite of hers, and certainly not anybody she wanted to marry. 3 months after she's there, Adolphus shows up. He gets a teaching position in Madrid. And so now she's happy again because she's close to Adolphus. He's actually working, and there's this possibility again. And for about a month, they're seeing each other every day. They go for carriage rides, they go for walks. There's a lot of walking out together, probably a lot of illicit kissing when people weren't looking, although she never actually says that. There's some code language in there that says they were at least having romantic talks about things. And then all of a sudden, he comes to the tavern and sits down with her and tells her that he's going home and that they can't be married. And I think what happened was the aunt and uncle took him aside and said, look, you're not going to marry her, so you might as well just leave. And he does. They re-exchange their love gifts, and he goes back to Addison County, and he marries her best friend. So I was horrified by that. But actually, later on, what you learn is that he brings her best friend, Aura Copeland, back out to Madrid, and she gets to spend time with her best friend. And even though her best friend is married to her former love, she seems to accept that. And actually, going forward, this is long after the diary, in my research I discovered that Adolphus himself died very young of probably tuberculosis and left Aura with 3 children all alone. So in many ways, one can think, I like to think, that she had a lucky escape. So going back, so once Adolphus is married to Aura, her family decides to let her come back to Vermont. The whole time that she was in New York, everything she wrote had some reference to home. And even though she denies it, this love for her home in Vermont really stayed strong. And so this is her writing about going home. Took leave of Hopkinton and its inhabitants, rode to Chandler's, then to Porter's, 15 miles to Bangor, called upon Miss Harmona Eddy, rode 10 miles to Smith's Chateauguay Four Corners. It appeared I could ride no further. My sides were swollen. Pained me greatly. Took a rest. Rode 8 miles further to Roberts, which made 36 miles today. Prepared supper for 9. Upwards of 60 stayed here, almost discouraged, unless I am better in the morning. Then the next day she writes, stormy. Began to find myself on the road to Vermont. And you can hear almost this uplift as she gets closer to home. 8 sleighs in company. Rode 8 miles to Oliver's, prepared breakfast for the whole, in good spirits. Rode 10 miles to Robinson's. And interestingly enough, Robinson's Tavern is a stone ruin along the Military Turnpike extension between Plattsburgh and Route 11, which is the main road that she would have traveled. So I knew about that as well. It's fascinating to me that all of these places just keep crisscrossing. Rode 10 miles to Bankers, that's Plattsburgh, left Bird and Eastman, rode 6 miles to Gordon's, and visited Plattsburgh Village. Crossed on Cumberland Head. It snowed so we could scarcely perceive the bushes in the cracks put up at Fletcher's. And what I would say about this is they used to either roller or plow across the lake, the frozen lake right there at Cumberland Head, long before it varies, of course. And they would stick bushes along the way, pieces of tree limbs and so on, so that you didn't lose your place on the ice. And that's what she's referring to. Put up at Fletcher's on Grand Isle. Prepared tea. Visited late with the ladies. They were preparing for an installation tomorrow. Not really sure what that was. Could never figure it out. The next day, crossed the lake. Found it very rough. 7 miles to Burlington. The handsomest situation I ever saw. Prepared breakfast for the last time on our short journey. I have not thought much about returning to my native place. Yeah, right. She wrote about it a lot. But from Burlington and Williston, I could discover the mountains rising with majestic grandeur, their snowy tops mingling with the clouds. It spread a delightful prospect of my nativity. Called at Hull's Inn in Heinsberg. Mr. Williams took his leave. Very cold. Called on Mr. Collins, but arrived in high spirits at Mr. Sweet's. And then the next day, she arrives home. So this journey back home for her is uplifting, wonderful experience. All of the things that she'd been pining for were there. Her grandmother and grandmother were still in good health. Her aunt and uncle had had another baby. The family was really happy to have her there, and all was well. And then she starts going to a series of friends' weddings. And almost everywhere she writes, but for the grace of God, go I, right? So it's like she's escaped this fate worse than death, that she didn't get married. And over and over again, there's these references to having escaped matrimony. And then little tiny references to Eastman showing up. And what really happened is, once harvest was over, he came to Vermont. Samuel Eastman was determined he was going to marry her. And so he came and he spent months wooing her, except that she apparently either didn't like it, didn't notice, or didn't want to admit that it was happening. And so that's what leads up to that entry of what a dreadful day this is. So she marries him, and he takes her back to Hopkinton. And that journey isn't quite as sad as the first journey was, but it's not all that happy either. And so there's a really interesting dynamic that gets set up. She never writes about him. She very seldom even uses his name. He's Mr. E sometimes, or my companion. But that's it. That's all. That's the reference that she uses over and over again. Some of that's conventions of the time, but also I think that it really kind of illustrates the distance that they had between them. And although they must have had at least, I believe they had a loving marriage, and this is why. They had 13 children. 12 of them lived to be adults. She may have had as many as 2 other miscarriages. So essentially, through her whole marriage, she was probably pregnant every other year, starting in 1824. And the diary ends just before the birth of her 5th child, which, and in many ways, it doesn't surprise me that the diary ends then, because she has so much going on, and she's taking care of all of these children, and she's doing all this work, and I can see where it kind of goes by the wayside. The only other writing that she did after this that I've discovered is 2 little travel diaries, a trip to Wisconsin with her husband much later, and then a trip back to Vermont a couple of years before she passed away. And so I think she just didn't write it after this. There's not a missing diary, in other words. There may be a missing earlier diary, because when she gets to page 77, she writes, "This is the second time I've covered 77 pages." So there may be a diary that still exists out there from her about the time that she was 14 till she was 19, but that's not anything I've ever been able to lay my hands on, and chances are it probably ended up in the dustbin. So the work that she did was fascinating, and I want to share a little bit of about that. At the end of the first year of her marriage, she writes on Thursday, February 12th, "Cold, frozen hard. The snow has fled. The chipping squirrel makes his appearance. I washed a large wash of linen. 1 year this day since we took possession of our cottage. Oh, what have I done? Nothing for my maker, but little for my partner. Spun only 73 runs, wove 70 yards, wove one coverlet, knit 3 pairs of socks, hope for more this year." Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but the reality is that's just a drop in the bucket to what this woman was doing. She, on average, about every 4 months, she was making several dozen to 4 dozen candles. In order to make candles, she had to render the animal lard to make the candles. She spun the candle wick. She sewed all of the clothing. And she might have only made 3 pairs of socks for her husband, but with the children, she would have been, I can just imagine what it was like to keep socks on children, and to keep the holes closed up. She was doing she was making fabric, but then she was taking this fabric and making it into clothing. And that against all of the other things that she had to do. There was one entry that really interested me. She talked about going out and collecting pine boughs and then boiling them. And I kept thinking, what in the world would she be doing that for? Until it dawned on me. She was making cleaner. And I came across a work of how to make household cleaning products. And that's exactly what she was doing. You boil the pine boughs. The oil from the pine needles floats to the top, so you have an oil that you use on your furniture. The liquid itself becomes a kind of an astringent, and it can be used to clean wounds, and it can be used and added with lye and made into cleaning products. So, we take all that for granted, right? We go down to the grocery store and we buy Pine Sol and whatever it is we're going to use to clean, but she was making her own cleaning products, making her own soap, all of that stuff that was all being manufactured and put together as she fed her family and baked, brewed, and preserved, because of course you have to not only provide food today, but you have to have food to provide all winter long. So it's a Herculean task that really kind of spins out in the diary, and you don't even see most of the stuff because I think she did it all in such a routine way that she hardly noticed sometimes how much she did. I went back through after that entry and I counted all of the textile stuff she did, and she had really underreported all the work that she did. So she didn't even have a sense herself of how much she was really producing for her family. And then the first baby was born, and I'll share that entry with you. And then I'll ask you to ask questions and give you a chance to ask some things about the diary itself. So Friday, May 7th, 1824, was rainy. Oh my God, what a day is this, and how hast thou supported me through it all. At 10:30 a.m., didst thou make me the mother of a lovely son, weighing 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Thanks to my God, it will never be a mother. Since it has been thy will to restore me to my bosom friend, that's a reference to her husband, by the way, and with this little pledge of love, instead of taking me from him, wilt thou grant us wisdom to bring it up in thy fear, teach him to remember his Creator in the days of his youth, greatly distressed through the night with her labor. E.H. Covey for a nurse, and Covey was a neighbor. So from her point of view, she had this beautiful child. She came through her labor safely. And of course, childbirth was dangerous. You could die from it, if especially a first child, because no one, could predict what kind of effect that would have on any woman's body. But then she found the time to thank God that it wasn't a woman. Doesn't that say something about her life? And yet, I don't think she was unhappy. She wrote often and quite eloquently about the beauty around her and her happiness with her friends. She wrote tons of letters. I've never found a single one that has been, I've searched everywhere. One of these days, maybe one will fall into my lap, but honestly, I know that she was constantly writing. I know that she was constantly getting letters, and she had a joy in all of that. She loved reading, even with all of the work that she did. She still managed to read. So I don't, despite the fact she didn't marry the first man she fell in love with, and despite the fact she lived so far away from Vermont and physically, I think she still had a happy life. And everything I know about her and what happens to her children and so on, I think that generally speaking, they were a pretty happy family. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Okay, so she was born in Starksboro on a hill farm just off of Quaker Road. But her mother died probably within weeks of her being born. And so her maternal grandmother, who lived on Bristol Flats, took her. Now, she was not the first child. She was actually the fifth child. The other 4 children were old enough and ambulatory, and they stayed on the farm with their dad. And she went to live with her grandparents. And she lived with her grandparents until she married. Well, except for the short piece that she was with her aunt and uncle. So
That was in Bristol.
That was in Bristol. And the house isn't there anymore, but you can sort of see where the farm was. Her grandfather, whose name was also Samuel Brooks, was a very substantial man. He held a lot of town offices. He wasn't an original proprietor, but he purchased land from an original proprietor when Bristol was called Pocock. And so she lived in a, I wouldn't say a well-to-do household, but certainly a household that had advantages. But at the same time, she worked all the time. She not only helped with the housework in the house, but she also did spinning, weaving, and sewing for neighbors, and she actually, for a time, had an arrangement with a New Haven businessman. He would give her cloth, and she would make shirts and then bring them back to him. And all of that was, you know, money that, in part, I think, was money that she used to put things away for going to housekeeping, which was a really important thing. But she also used her own money to pay to go to school. So that was something that was really, obviously, really important to her. So, yes.
In the newspaper, it mentioned that she had been a friend, a Quaker.
Yes, she was, her whole life.
Were there allusions to, I mean, did she talk about Quaker meetings?
She doesn't ever say I'm a Quaker, but I know she was a member of the Friends because she is recorded in the Friends book in the Ferrisburg meeting, and I know that she remained a Quaker because, and this is one of the funny stories that come out of the diary, is at one point there's a kind of an epidemic that's happening in Hopkinton, and it sounds like some sort of a pneumonia or respiratory disease, and Samuel gets it. And at first they don't seem to take it that seriously, but then the doctor comes and basically says, get your affairs in order because people are dying from this. And that really frightened him and her. And so they prayed together, and he did I'll go to church if I get better promise. And part of the reason for that was because before that he'd been totally irreverent, and there was a constant tension between them because he and Lee would go fishing on Sunday, and they would do all these things that she didn't think was really good to do on a Sabbath. And so he got better, and he kept his word, and the two of them went to church. Now, there was no Quaker meeting close to them, and so instead they went to the Baptist church, which was right close by, and it just so happened that that church was experiencing a revival of the Second Great Awakening type, and he was saved. And so suddenly he became a Baptist, and he wanted to have his children baptized, and she was adamantly opposed to it. And so one of the major tensions in their marriage was that difference. She wanted him, he actually came from Quakers, but he himself had, sort of gotten away from it, and his newly revived faith was not at all being a member of the Friends. It was about being an evangelical Baptist. And at one point there was actually a plot to take her by surprise and get her baptized. But her sister-in-law felt so guilty that they were working behind her back that she warned her, so she didn't actually get forcibly baptized. But so there's some of that kind of antics there. Yes?
If they were fairly well-off farmers, did she have any household help?
No. In
Because
fact,
that's a little unusual.
well, the Brooks's daughter, the Brooks's daughter-in-law, Lavina, and Phoebe seem to have done most, if not all, of the housework. She talks about scrubbing floors and doing the laundry and so on. So, and the Brookses were friends as well. And so I think if they had any help that came in, it was not every day.
So she didn't have any in her own household when she married?
Oh,
after she
no.
married?
In
Okay.
fact, not only did she not have help, she was mortified at just how pokey and little, and it was a log cabin and the logs shed, and so she was constantly trying to whitewash the logs and keep them from shedding dust. And, so her life with Samuel was definitely, at least at first,
She
was
came
definitely
down in the world.
Yes. But not really, because, this was typical of farm life. You start out with, you build the barn first, and then you build you know, and so eventually that house was renovated and built on, and it's still there. You can see it. People live in it actually, and I suspect that that log cabin is buried somewhere deeply inside of the modern structure. So, yes.
Phoebe growing up as a Quaker at that time, I imagine her family would not want her to marry outside of the faith. So I was thinking that if Adolphus was not a Quaker, that would have been a real no-no for her.
Yeah, and it
She
may.
would have been read at a meeting kind of thing.
Well, you know, it's interesting because what's happening at the same time among the Friends is a kind of schism. And so eventually her brothers, Phoebe's brothers, get caught up in that because they become involved in the Underground Railroad, and they become involved in, they move to Ontario, and there's a lot of Friends who locate there, and one of her brothers, Isaac, gets read out for being involved in the Underground Railroad because the Friends had split between the Hicksites and the Orthodox. And so I suspect that initially their disapproval of
They're
Adolphus,
still both Quakers at least.
well, yes, but they tended not to like each other a whole lot. And reading some of the Canadian Friends minutes from that particular, from the Yonge Street meeting, which is where they belong, sounded to me like there was a lot of internal divisions that were developing. But going back to Phoebe and Adolphus, it may well be that that was one of the issues with him. But but it should have been an issue with Samuel as well, and it wasn't.
But what, was Samuel a Quaker?
Well, his grandparents were, but
So he was
his
a Quaker
parents not so much, and then he not at all, really.
Eventually.
Yes. So. Yes.
The Willard School, is the building still standing?
Yes. In fact, the house that Emma Willard launched her school in is opposite the green in Middlebury. It faces Middlebury College. I forget what the street is, but it's after you cross the bridge and go down through
Yep.
the main part of town.
Yep.
Instead of turning to go up towards Middlebury College, if you go straight, it's right along there. And in fact, there were multiple schools. The reason Emma Willard came to Middlebury was because she'd come to be a teacher at a girls' school, but then that particular school died. She married John Willard, became a housewife, and the interesting part of that story is that when Middlebury National Bank was robbed, local people thought it was an inside job, and so they held the trustees responsible for the robbery, and they had to use their personal fortune to make up the difference, and that ruined her husband. He was a trustee. So at that point, I sort of have this little, like, 10-second video that runs in my head, the two of them sitting at morning breakfast, and she's saying, well, I know, dear, I can open a school. And history is made. She creates a school that's entirely different from the school she taught in. One of the things, I think one of the reasons why she gave up teaching at the first school is because she wasn't allowed to teach what she wanted to teach. And Emma Willard's school was definitely exactly what she wanted to teach, which was what boys were learning. She'd petitioned Middlebury College to let her go and observe exams, for instance, which were orally done at the time, and they wouldn't let her into the building because they said a woman there would be too distracting. So that was her ambition.
Was there any information about food or cooking guide?
She writes a little bit about food, but for the most part, it'll be things like the first beans came out of the garden today, or that she baked pies with her aunt. But there are not descriptions of food. The interesting recipes that she records are recipes for medical things, for both the animals as well as for people. One recipe is to deal with worms in sheep and things like that. So I think cooking was something that she just did, and she did a lot of it, especially in the spring. One of the things we were just talking about how well off Samuel was. Samuel owned a team of oxen, which by today's standard is like state of the art John Deere, quadruple tires on it going down the road kind of thing, right? And his oxen were the power that powered a lot of farm equipment in the area. So he would take his oxen and go to multiple farms, and they would plow or whatever it is they were doing, and then and all the men would go from farm to farm to farm, and when they were on Samuel's farm, they would be staying there, and she would be feeding them, and she wrote about feeding 40 people, and sometimes they would even spend the night during both spring planting season as well as fall harvest season. So she cooked a lot, but she didn't write a lot about cooking. Yes.
Do you know how old she was when she died?
She was 62.
That was a good age for
Yeah,
you, isn't it?
yeah. She, considering how many children she had and how hard she worked, I think that actually was pretty good. Her husband survived her by 2 years, and they're both buried in the Parishville Baptist Church Cemetery. I don't know if that means she gave in. I was told somewhere that she didn't necessarily have to have become a Baptist to be buried there. And I couldn't tell. I went to the records to see if I could find if she was ever added, but I couldn't tell that she was.
But maybe her husband.
But her husband was a member in good standing, and so that may well be why she was buried there. So, along with one of their children that didn't. Her oldest son, the boy that was born, died during the Civil War in Baltimore. He was in the military. But a lot of her children married. Not all of them had children, but there are descendants out there. So, and I met a woman in Ferrisburg once when I was working on the book who told me that she had a very vague memory of a woman who they referred to as Aunt Phoebe. She was related to the Orvises, and it could be her that they were talking about. But the problem is that family names get repeated over and over again, and so Phoebe had an Aunt Phoebe. She also had a cousin named Phoebe. So it's difficult to say. But certainly, the other thing that I looked for and never found was a picture of her. That doesn't mean that she didn't have a photograph taken. Certainly photography was available by the Civil War, at least. But there are no images of her, which is why the book cover is a watercolor without a face, is because we really don't know what she looks like, or looked like, sorry. Yes?
Did you pick up much information about the Durfee family in the process?
Well, I know that the Durfees came from Bristol as well.
Quakers.
They were Quakers. And Mrs. Durfee was Phoebe's mother's sister, and that was their connection. So, and there were also many different cousins, and I didn't always figure out all of the family connections because she referred to cousins that were there was quite an articulation to get to cousin, and I wasn't always sure of it. In fact, recently I got an email from someone who asked me how she was related to the Van Vliets, and I know that she referred to Frederick Van Vliet as her cousin, but I couldn't ever determine exactly how that relationship actually comes together. So, yes.
How long did her grandparents live? Does she talk about them dying while she was in
Yes. Her grandmother passed away, I think, the last year of the diary. Her grandfather after that. And they were really her parents, so I think for her that was, and her father, I should say something about her father. Her father remarried. He didn't stay on the hill farm. About 4 or 5 years after Phoebe was born, he married a woman, her name was Ruth Brown, from Ferrisburg, and he sold the hill farm and moved and bought another farm on the Little Chicago Road. I'm sorry, the other side of Little Chicago, South Middlebrook Road. And in fact, the farmhouse is still there. And that's, if you turn off of Route 7 there in Ferrisburg, they've got a light there now. If you turn off, you're going south and you go to the left, there's the Methodist Church where Frederick Douglass spoke. Just past there on the right-hand side, there's a cemetery, and that's where that's where her father and his second wife and some of their children are buried, which is literally just down the road from where they lived. She visited with them, and she referred to Ruth as Mother Brown sometimes. So it's kind of interesting, but, and when she came back to Vermont the last time, she visited with her. It's kind of interesting. One of the arcs of the diary that really fascinated me is the trip out, the very first trip out to New York. It took 4.5 days, right? And they walked a lot of the way, but that trip back to Vermont in 1862, I think it was. She did it in one day. Her husband took her to Canton. She got on a train. She took a train from Canton to Plattsburgh, got on a ferry, went from Plattsburgh across to Burlington, got on another train, took the train from Burlington to Ferrisburg, and they knew she was coming because she sent a telegraph. Or telegram, I mean. And so, just in the space of, basically 25 years, life had completely changed. And I think that's one of the things that's really fascinating about the antebellum period is that's the period that we go from being very much like our colonial ancestors, going all the way back to the Pilgrims, and all of that changes in the matter of a generation. And we have steam engines, we have railroads, we have the telegraph, we have cheap newspaper, industrialization's begun, the Burlington woolen mill is already operating, things are really changing. And I see Phoebe as a kind of transitional character as well. She starts out she does a lot of spinning and weaving and all of that by hand in her home, as it had been done for hundreds of years. And when a spinning mill opened at the Falls, New Haven Falls, she started buying her warp thread from them. So her cloth was literally an interweaving of the old and the new. And of course, eventually she was buying manufactured cloth and so on. But she continued to sew because ready-made clothing wasn't anything that would be available in her lifetime, for men or for women, for that matter. So, yes?
Were there any connections that you found between Phoebe and the Robinsons and Rokeby and Ferrisburg?
I expected there would be some, and I've never found any direct connections, but I know that she probably attended meetings that they attended. The Robinsons themselves were kind of on the edge. They were never disowned, but they were obviously involved in the Underground Railroad, something that Quakers generally were feeling uncomfortable with. So I can't say that she did, but I can't believe that she didn't, given that she was living fairly close to them. And one of the things that was amazing to me in looking at just her perambulations throughout the area is, in any given day, she could leave the farm on Bristol Flats, walk to New Haven Mills to buy thread for her loom, walk to New Haven Center to either drop off shirts or pick up cloth to make shirts, and then walk back to the farm. And then periodically, she and her grandmother would hitch up the wagon and go into Middlebury and go shopping to various people's stores and get a new hat or whatever. They went to Moncton all the time. The Claps were also relatives, and so they visited with the Claps who lived there. She went to 4th of July celebrations in Regents. You know, they moved all in the same area, so I'm sure that she knew them, but she never mentions them directly. So,
Susan, we want to thank you so much for this, and we want to present you.
oh well, thank you.
And Susan will be signing books. If you would like to purchase books out here, we'll send her out now so she can get seated before the
Well,
crunch
thank you
goes
very
out.
much.
And I know that she will.
Before you
answer
leave,
more
I'll just
questions.
make a quick note about our future talks. Normally, I would tell you who the speaker is next month, which will be March 18th. Okay, so if you're a St. Patrick's Day celebrant, you'll have a little time to recover before the next talk here. The problem is that the speaker who we have lined up has some family obligations that may interfere with that date. So we might be juggling some of our speakers. Right now, we're booked through July. So we may be asking one of those other speakers to switch dates with her. So stand by to find out who that is. But I would like to put in one more plug for our fundraiser, which is March 24th. And you know, we have very limited seating, and so tickets have not yet been sold. If you would like to pick up a couple, I'll be out in the lobby also.
What time is the fundraiser?
It's at 2 o'clock. Yep, and we're doing it on Saturday because we don't want to get the fundraiser mixed in with the third Sunday of the month lectures, which will continue as on schedule. Okay, thank you all for coming, and refreshments are still available, so help yourself.